Take my baby, please. She begged the Marine in the snow. His canine refused to let her walk away. Snow had been falling on the mountain roads outside Bryson City, North Carolina, since early afternoon. The kind of heavy, wet December snow that comes down through the hemlocks and curtains and sits on the blacktop like it means to stay, and the temperature on Thomas Vance's dashboard read 23 degrees when his headlights found her. A young woman standing at the shoulder of Route 28 with a car seat in both arms, waving one hand above her head, her other arm locked under the handle like she would not let go of it for anything in the world. In the passenger seat, Colt went rigid. He didn't bark. He turned his head to the tree line, not to the woman, which was the thing that made Thomas brake instead of just slow down. At the edge of Thomas's headlights, barely visible in the snow and the dark, a second set of headlights was parked 100 yards back on a gravel pull-off, engine running, not moving, waiting. What Thomas Vance discovered when he rolled down that window would pull back the curtain on a cruelty that had been running for 11 months inside a mountain home that smelled like a grandmother's kitchen, and hid something else entirely behind a locked door. Before we go any further, this is the kind of story this channel tells, and there are more coming. If you're new here, subscribe. You'll want to be here for the next one. Thomas had been a Marine for 12 years and was 34 years old, and was in the precise way that men trained to be useful in extreme circumstances often are. Not entirely sure what to do with himself when the circumstances were ordinary. He had grown up in Knoxville, the son of a man named James Vance who had served in the 1st Marine Division and come home from Beirut in 1983 with a limp he never fully explained and a faith in the Corps that he passed to. His son, the way other fathers pass down tools or trades. James had died 8 months ago, in April, from a heart that had been working harder than it should have for a long time, and finally asked to be let off the job. Thomas had been in Okinawa when it happened, and had gotten home in time for the funeral, and not much else, and the grief of it had settled into him in layers. The first fast and sharp, the kind you feel in your chest like a fist, and the deeper kind that came later, slow and quiet, finding him on the drives he took in the evenings when the apartment felt too much like a held breath. He had been at his mother's house in Asheville for 4 days, trying to be useful in the ways a son is useful after a parent is gone, going through his father's things, carrying boxes, sitting at the kitchen table at night drinking coffee while his mother talked about James in the present tense the way people do when the past tense still costs too much. He was driving back to Knoxville now, taking the mountain route because he always had, because his father had driven it with him when he was 12 and told him the names of the peaks as they came into view on clear days. And Thomas had never stopped listening for them even when it was dark and snowing, and he couldn't see anything past the tree line. Colt had been with him for 3 years, assigned through a veteran support program and trained for the specific kind of work Thomas needed. Not danger, not patrol, just the private emergencies that nobody else could see. He was a fawn and black Belgian Malinois with a way of sitting against Thomas's left leg during the moments that were difficult, that felt less like dog behavior and more like a decision. He did not perform comfort. He simply arrived at the right place and stayed there, breathing, until the thing passed. Thomas trusted Colt's read on a room or a road or a situation the way he trusted the instinct he'd spent 12 years developing. When Colt turned toward the tree line instead of the woman, Thomas understood that the woman was not the whole situation. He rolled down the window. The young woman came to the door fast, her arms still locked around the car seat, her face red from cold, and something else. Not crying, past the point where crying would do anything. She was maybe 22, wearing a canvas barn coat over a hooded sweatshirt, sneakers in the snow. She looked at Thomas, then at Colt, then back at Thomas, and said, "Please take my baby. Please, they'll be here soon. And I can't let them find her." A baby, 9 or 10 months old, bundled in a pink fleece suit, sleeping with the absolute unconcerned peace that only babies in the middle of crises seem to manage. He looked back at the pull-off 100 yards behind them. The headlights hadn't moved. He told her to get in the truck. She looked at the pull-off. She looked at him. Something in her, some calculation about trust and risk and the specific math of how bad things could get, finished itself in about 2 seconds. She climbed in. Her name was Jessie Pruitt. The baby's name was Clara. Jessie had been living for the past 8 months with her grandmother, Ruth Pruitt, in Ruth's house on Laurel Branch Road, 7 miles from where they were sitting on the shoulder of Route 28, with the snow coming down and the engine running and the headlights in the pull-off still not moving. She had left the house 2 hours ago when she overheard a phone call she wasn't supposed to hear. She had taken Clara, taken the diaper bag, taken the keys to her grandmother's car, and had made it 3 miles down the mountain before the car went sideways on a patch of black ice and into the ditch. Thomas asked about the headlights in the pull-off. Jessie said that was her Uncle Donnie's truck. She said she'd seen it parked on the road outside the house twice that day. She said Donnie always did that, parked down the road, not in the driveway, the way someone does when they want to see without being seen. Thomas asked what Donnie had said on the phone. Jessie said he told someone that he was coming tonight, that the paperwork was done and Saturday was confirmed, and that by the time anyone figured out what happened, it would already be legal. She said her grandmother didn't know. She said Ruth thought Donnie was helping her. Ruth had been thinking that for 11 months, because Donnie had been careful about how he helped. One small thing at a time, one small removal at a time, until the shape of Ruth's world was something Donnie had built instead of something Ruth had chosen. Have you ever known someone whose kindness was actually a slow removal? A parent, an aunt, a neighbor, someone whose help was really control, taken piece by piece until they had everything and the person had nothing? Tell me about them in the comments. They deserve to be remembered. Ruth Pruitt was 77 years old and had lived on Laurel Branch Road for 44 years, the last 5 of them alone, in a house she and her husband Harold had built with 2 other families in the summer of 1979, trading weekends of labor and meals on sawhorses and a kind of neighborly accounting that had nothing to do with money. Harold had been a Marine, a staff sergeant in the 1st Marine Division, and had died in Beirut on October 23, 1983, in the barracks bombing that killed 241 American servicemen before the mourning had properly started. Ruth had been 36 years old when it happened, with 1 son at home and a life that had been built in partnership with a man who was suddenly not there to help carry it. She had carried it anyway. She had raised Donnie, worked 22 years as a school secretary at Swain County High, kept the house, kept the garden, kept the small rituals that made a house feel like more than 4 walls and a roof. The apple butter she put up every October, the way she arranged Harold's photographs on the dresser in the bedroom, the collection of coffee mugs with sayings on them that visitors always smiled at, lined up on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet in the order she'd acquired them, which was also the order of certain years she didn't want to forget. She had begun to have some trouble with her memory 2 years ago. Not the serious kind, not the kind that took people away from themselves, but the kind that made certain words arrive a moment late, that made her lose a name occasionally and find it an hour later. Donnie had been the one to notice, or to say he'd noticed, which was the first piece of the architecture he was building. He had come to visit more. He had started paying her bills. He had suggested gently that maybe someone should have her power of attorney in case anything happened, and Ruth, who had always been practical, had agreed. He had recommended a doctor friend for her evaluation. The evaluation had noted mild cognitive changes consistent with early aging. Donnie had the report. Ruth had been given a summary. He had started asking Jessie to leave the house 8 months ago, framing it as concern, that the baby was stressful for Ruth, that Ruth needed quiet. Jessie had stayed because Ruth had asked her to stay, had asked her with a directness that told Jessie the asking cost her something. But Donnie had been working on that too, in the way he worked on everything. One small conversation at a time, one repositioned fact, one gentle implication that Jessie's presence was a burden Ruth was too polite to name. Jessie had stayed, and she had been watching, and what she had been watching was the slow rearrangement of her grandmother's world into something smaller and more controllable, with Donnie at the center of everything that mattered. Thomas drove to Laurel Branch Road with Jessie in the passenger seat and Clara asleep in the car seat in the back, and Colt sitting up straight, watching the rear view. The headlights from the pull-off had followed them for the first 2 miles and then turned off at the junction for the county road, which meant Donnie knew where they were going and was taking a different route to the same place. The house at the end of Laurel Branch Road had a porch light on and smoke coming from the chimney, and a wreath on the front door, a Christmas wreath with a red bow, the kind of detail that told you the person inside still cared about the calendar and what it meant. Ruth opened the door before they knocked. She looked at Jessie, then at the baby, then at Thomas, and her face did the thing that faces do when relief and fear arrive at the exact same moment. and you can't entirely tell them apart. She said, come in, and stood back from the door, and Colt walked past her legs into the house without breaking stride. And Ruth looked down at him and then up at Thomas with an expression that was almost a question and almost a welcome. Inside, the house was warm and smelled like wood smoke and the particular sweetness of something baked earlier in the day. Thomas noticed what the warmth was keeping you from noticing at first. The kitchen shelf where the mug should have been had only 2 mugs on it. The dresser that should have been in the bedroom, he could see through the open door, was not there. The bedroom contained a single bed, a lamp, a chair. No photographs, no personal objects of any kind except a sweater folded on the chair. Colt walked down the short hallway to a door on the left, a utility room by the look of the door. He sat in front of it and put one paw against the frame. Thomas tried the handle. Locked. He looked at Ruth. He asked quietly if this was her room. Ruth looked at the door. She started to say something about how Donnie had thought it would be better to have her closer to the kitchen in the winter, for warmth. She said it without looking at Thomas, in the voice of a woman who has said a thing so many times that she's not sure anymore whether she believed it when she started. Thomas didn't push. He said he understood. He asked if she had a key. She said Donnie kept the key. Behind the locked door, he could see nothing, but Colt was still sitting with his paw against the frame. And that was enough. They were in the kitchen, Ruth holding Clara in the careful, practiced way of a woman who had done this before with other babies, when headlights came up the driveway. If you were sitting in that kitchen right now, knowing what Thomas knew, would you stay? Type yes or no below. I read every one of them. Donnie Pruitt was 52, broad, wearing a Carhartt jacket with a county contractor's badge clipped to the chest. The badge of a man who had found that things with official-looking attachments moved easier through the world. He came through the front door, the way people come through a door they have a key to, without slowing, without checking, with the body language of someone who had decided a long time ago that ownership and permission were roughly the same thing. He looked at Jesse. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Colt. Colt moved. He came off the floor and placed himself between Ruth's chair and the center of the room without a command, without a sound yet, and stood with his head low and level and his eyes on Donnie. And then the growl started, low and unbroken and deliberate, the sound of something that had already made up its mind and was simply waiting. Donnie looked at the dog. He looked at Thomas. He pulled his eyes back to Ruth and smiled, the particular smile of a man who has learned that smiling in a room of witnesses costs him nothing and establishes a story he can tell later. He said it was late and he was glad Ruth had company, but then he needed to speak with her about a few things, and that maybe Jessie and her friend could give them some privacy. He reached into his jacket and put a set of papers on the kitchen table. He said the residential placement evaluation had come back, and the facility had an opening on Saturday, and it was really the best option for everyone, and that Ruth had agreed to this. He looked at Ruth when he said it, that Ruth had been part of this conversation from the beginning. Ruth looked at the papers. She looked at her hands. She was holding Clara very still, the way people hold a baby when something in the room has gone uncertain, and they need one thing to be steady. Then she said it, quietly, not to Thomas, not to Donnie, not to the room, just to the air in front of her, the way a person says a true thing they've been keeping inside so long that it comes out almost accidentally. He moved my Harold's picture to the shed. Donnie started to say something. Thomas looked at him, and Donnie stopped. Thomas was not loud. He was never loud in a confrontation. He had learned in 12 years of situations where the loudest voice was the most frightened one, that authority came from stillness, from specificity, from the quiet presentation of things that were simply true. He said he had called a woman named Patricia Ahrens, who was a licensed elder law attorney in Bryson City, from the truck on the way here. He said Patricia had confirmed that a power of attorney obtained during a period of documented medical evaluation was subject to challenge on grounds of undue influence, and that the pattern of isolation, asset repositioning, and living arrangement changes over 11 months constituted a textbook presentation of financial elder abuse under North Carolina statute. He said he had taken photographs of the locked bedroom door, the empty dresser space, and the near-empty kitchen shelf. He said Jessie had a recorded voicemail of the phone call she'd overheard, which had gone to Patricia Ahrens' office 40 minutes ago. He said he was not a lawyer and he was not making legal threats. He was telling Donnie what existed so that Donnie understood the shape of where he was standing. Colt had not moved. He was still between Ruth's chair and Donnie, still low, still growling at a register that had not changed, still watching Donnie with eyes that had not blinked. Donnie picked the papers up from the table. He looked at them in his hands, and then he looked at his mother, and for just a moment his face showed something underneath the composed exterior. Not remorse, not quite, but the look of a man who has been doing something for a long time while telling himself a story about it, and has just felt the story crack. He left without speaking. Colt watched the door. He watched it for 30 full seconds after it closed. Then he turned and walked to Ruth's chair and lay down at her feet, and the growl stopped, and the room breathed again. What came in the weeks that followed came in the way things come to small mountain communities when something wrong has been righted. Quietly, and then all at once, Patricia Ahrens filed for review of the power of attorney on Monday morning. The Swain County Adult Protective Services Office opened a formal investigation the same week, building on documentation Jessie had been keeping in a notes app on her phone for 4 months, not knowing if she'd ever use it, just knowing she should have it. The Saturday placement was blocked by an emergency court stay filed Friday afternoon. The locked bedroom door was opened by a locksmith on Tuesday, in the presence of Patricia's associate and a witness from the county office, and what was inside was what Ruth had been kept from. Harold's photographs, arranged on the dresser in the order she had put them 30 years ago, and her medications in their correct bottles, and the quilt her mother had made, folded at the foot of the bed, where it had always been. And on the nightstand, a copy of the New Testament with a paper bookmark in Philippians, where Harold had underlined a verse before his last deployment, and Ruth had never moved the bookmark. Because why would she? The congregation of Laurel Baptist Church, which Ruth had attended for 39 years and from which Donnie had gently discouraged visitors for the better part of a year, found out on Sunday morning. Pastor Glenn Morrow announced it from the pulpit without drama, the way pastors in small congregations announce things that matter. Plainly, in the middle of the service, with a brief pause afterward that everyone understood. 14 people showed up at Ruth's house that afternoon, with food and firewood and company, and Ruth sat in her own kitchen with Clara on her lap and Harold's photograph back on the dresser where she could see it through the door. And she cried once, briefly, and then she stopped and accepted a piece of coconut cake from a woman named Loretta, who had brought one every time there had been a reason to bring one for the past 20 years. Thomas stayed through Tuesday. He told himself he was making sure the legal process was in motion, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that on Sunday afternoon he had found, in the box of Harold's things that had been moved to the shed, a photograph. It was a 4x6 snapshot, the color slightly faded the way photographs from the early 1980s fade, showing 2 young men in uniform with the ocean behind them. Harold Pruitt on the left, grinning. On the right, a man Thomas recognized from a photograph his mother kept on her bureau in Asheville. A young man with a narrow jaw and eyes that were his own eyes, standing with his arm around Harold Pruitt's shoulder on a naval base in Beirut 3 weeks before the bombing. His father, Thomas, held the photograph for a long time. He had read his father's service memoirs twice since the funeral, filling in the blanks of the stories his father had told, partially in the ones he'd never told at all. There was a passage in the memoir's 3rd section, the part his father had written in the evenings over many years, not for publication but for his son to have someday, about the morning of October 23, 1983, about a staff sergeant named Harold, who had been 2 floors up when the building came down and had somehow found him in the debris and pulled, with hands that must have already been hurt until Thomas's father was in the light and not the dark. His father had written, "I never found him afterward. I looked. I always thought I would find him one day, and I never did." He had not found him, but something else had, in a December snow on a mountain road in North Carolina, through a dog who knew to look at the tree line, and a young woman with a baby in her arms, in a house 7 miles away where a photograph had been waiting in a shed. He gave the photograph to Ruth that evening. She held it in both hands. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Thomas, and she said, "Your father had a good face. Harold always said so. There are moments that arrive in the exact shape of the thing you didn't know you needed." Thomas had been carrying his father's death for 8 months without a place to set it down. He was not ready to set it down yet, but he understood, sitting at Ruth Pruitt's kitchen table, with Colt asleep at his feet, and Clara in a bouncy seat on the counter, making her private assessments of the ceiling. That carrying things was not the same as being alone with them. His father had not been alone, not that morning. Not ever, as long as he had carried Harold Pruitt with him through the 40 years after Beirut. He simply hadn't known whose house it was. This story is for every person who has been slowly moved out of their own life, one small thing at a time, and who has not yet been found. And for every person who stopped on a snowy road because a dog looked at something they hadn't seen yet. Is there a Ruth in your life? Someone's grandmother or mother who has been quietly managed into a corner while everyone said it was for their own good? Tell me about them below. Fill this section with their names. They deserve to be remembered out loud. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that means something to you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more to tell. Which moment in this story will stay with you? I'll see you in the comments.